Today's video is going to be a review and discussion of the Veritas Medium Router Plane made by Lee Valley. I paid about $154 after tax. I've had this for a little while. I wanted to use it long enough that I kind of understood the downsides, what I liked about it, etc., etc. So I'm getting around to review, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 months ago. It's not been that long, so the price should probably still be relatively the same, and it was when I actually started filming this today. Now this is my first router plane. I am primarily a power tool person. I have hand tools, but I mainly use them to either do features that power tools can't do, or that I'd have to buy an extremely expensive specialized niche power tool for, or I do them to kind of clean up or fill in gaps in power tool performance. Now when it comes to router planes, most companies make a large full size. It'll have 2 handle knob kind of things on it. A lot of them make a small, which is really quite small. And then there's kind of Lee Valley, Veritas, I guess I'll just call it, and like 1 or 2 Chinese ones that make a medium. Though what I want to say up front, and I did a lot of research trying to figure out the exact size of this relative to others and how it would work, is that this is much closer in footprint to the Lee Valley small than it is to the Lee Valley Veritas full size and to other full size routers. So even though they call it a medium, it doesn't actually split the difference and sit in the middle. It's closer to the small in footprint. I'll bring you in real quick here to give you an idea of actually how big this thing is, because that was very important to me when I was trying to figure out which one to buy, as I actually needed something relatively small and I needed to know exactly what this was going to look like. For reference, this entire board is about 14.5 by 6.25. This itself is about 3.5 wide at the widest points, 3 or so deep, though this can be flipped around into a bullnose configuration, so it can go kind of wider out that way, but I'm not going to count that as for the measurement. And then when the blade is fully down, kind of in that, just touching on the surface, we're looking at about 3.5 inches in height, though of course if you needed to store this, you can always remove this and store it that way. Now my hands are about 8 inches from the bottom of the palm to the tip of the finger, and then this palm itself is like, I don't know, about 3.5. So this is what it looks like in my hands if I'm gripping it the way they intended, or at least the photos have it as being gripped, and I think feels the most natural, something like that. So relatively small, but also not small. It's got some good heft to it, and it's got just enough grip kind of points to it to make it not totally uncomfortable to use for long periods of time, though we will come to that. If it was much smaller than this, my hands might be a little too big to use something much smaller comfortably, I guess I'll say. This is kind of right at the point of comfortability for me in terms of how small it is. But you can see when you're doing work, if you've got hands like mine, which size-wise, I would say my hands are slightly above average, but they're not big. You are kind of enveloping this thing quite a bit, and fingers-wise, you can get 2 on here and a thumb on the back, but it's kind of like a tight 2 kind of crimping in there. And I usually end up kind of more like this, if that makes sense, with one hold like that. But overall, that's what the size is. If you're wondering about the size, there's all the measurements relative to my hand and this board. While we're in here, let's just talk about some of the features. We've got a very nicely machined flat, I think this is cast iron. I'm fairly certain. It certainly feels like the heft of cast iron. You can buy it with or without a 1/4 inch blade. This medium, and I'll talk about this in a bit, holds the same blades as the full size, which is a big selling point. But the stock one you can buy with it is a 1/4 inch, or you can buy it without that blade for like $20 or $30 less. It comes with its own depth stop, though there is a bit of finickiness to that. And then, like I said earlier, you can also, through a little process, swap this around and go out the other direction for, I guess, what do we call that, bullnose work. This is just a very simple screw mechanism that holds it on together. It's relatively basic, which I like because that means there's less that can break. When we get to the downsides, one of the ones, it's more in the middle, it's not an entire downside, is that these are awkward to sharpen. If you've never sharpened one before, there are a lot of good videos online though, and I picked it up relatively quickly. But when you first get this, if you have never looked online, it's like taking a 1/4 inch chisel, trying to sharpen it freehand, but also having it stick out at a 90-degree angle. It's very awkward. So let's talk about why I bought this, or more specifically, why I bought the medium size versus the full size, or the small. My number one priority was that I did need to do work on small pieces, especially small little tenons. So while I was certainly shopping for the large to an extent, I was more choosing between a medium and a small, as I knew for a fact, and I'll show you this, that the full-size router was going to make it, it would just cover up this entire little tenon. I'd never be able to see it. It would just be, it'd be far too large. So I knew I needed something medium or small. Even though this is on the smaller end of what I work with, I do need it to work for something this small. So that was a big reason I chose the medium, is that it has the features of the larger ones with the blade kind of variability in terms of being able to choose a wider variety of sizes. But in terms of footprint, it can work on very small features. Now, I will definitely say the price was very alluring. The full-size one is like $280 or something like that. This at about $154 was much more acceptable to my stomach when I hit the purchase button. And overall, I just wasn't convinced I needed the full size. And so I knew for sure I'd be okay with the medium. It had enough features from the full size to be okay. I wasn't convinced the small was good enough because it couldn't fit the big blade. So in the end, I ended up in the middle. Lee Nielsen doesn't sell a medium. I considered their small one. If they sold a medium and it was similar in price, I may have gone with them. I don't know. I'm very happy I went with this, but there's not a lot of options in the medium. So if you're looking for the same thing I'm looking for, you're kind of stuck actually with the medium. Let's cover the upsides first. Obviously, number one, the price. Excellent quality tool, $154 I think is reasonable for something that should last you forever. You may need to replace blades or buy different size blades, but I cannot think of a reason that this would somehow stop working or break on its own. Maybe it's possible, but this will probably be handed down or sold at a garage sale after you die. And I mean that. When you hold it, you can absolutely tell that this thing is going to last a very long time, or it absolutely better. Most of the upsides are also the reasons why I bought it. So price, size, again, I needed some amount of reference surface. I wanted as much as I could while also still being able to work on smaller pieces. I thought the bullnose feature was very nice. I've always wanted to do more hinges, but they're super expensive. Nice hinges are, so I stay away. But I've got some cheap ones around and I'd love to practice. Trying to use a Dremel router to get it out of there was a mess. Being able to flip around to do hinges in the bullnose, extremely nice. And to get in tight little corners of areas, being able to see, excellent feature there. Obviously, being able to take larger blades, huge. And I'm kind of assuming that's why Veritas created the medium, but kept the footprint closer to the small. They figured there'd be some people who wanted a footprint closer to the small, but wanted a wide variety of blade sizes. That would just be my guess as to why this was created and why there aren't a ton of other options for a medium. Now, it wasn't essential that it came with it, but I was very happy that it came with a depth stop. And if it didn't and they sold one, I would have bought the depth stop. I think this is relatively important if you plan on doing anything where you know you need to get an exact depth ahead of time and you don't want to have to be sitting there trying to figure out every time you move the cutter down. So excellent to just have it in there so you don't have to worry about remembering to order it or having it be back ordered or any kind of thing that happens to relatively high-end accessories. Sometimes you just can't get a hold of them and you really need one. Okay, so what are the downsides here? Well, some of them are more like mirror images of the upsides. One, it's a lot less reference surface that you're coming into contact with. Something that is very important in woodworking is having our initial reference surface. So let's just, for example, call the face of this board the reference surface. It is the surface that every other thing we are doing to the workpiece is relative to. So for example, to get these at 90 degrees each and straight, it really helps to have this flat, because then we can get the other side parallel and flat. And then when we lay it down on our table saw, our 90-degree cut here, and when that's 90 degrees and straight to the face, we can then have a 90-degree crosscut or whatever angle we'd like as our crosscut. Those three things all rely on the reference surface of the top of the board. When we use a tool such as a router plane, we are looking for this base to come into contact with this reference surface, and everything that's done with the router plane, such as removing something at an equivalent plane to the reference surface, relies on this reference surface being correct and then how much contact we can make with it. For example, imagine we're trying to get a little tenon here to remove some height. This is something I needed this for, but we also want it to be 90 degrees, or sorry, 90 degrees, parallel to the top here. And let's assume this was only the size of like a ruler head here. Anytime we tipped over, we would immediately have problems. Our ability to capture a large amount of that reference surface and still go over the top is extremely crucial to keeping this tenon top, for example, parallel to the face. Obviously, it's going to help if your face is correct because everything is referenced off of there. But downside-wise, there's not a ton. Upside-wise, there's enough. But if you are looking to have something that requires a large amount of, I'll call it protrusion away from your reference surface, so some kind of long tenon extension out to the end, this is not going to be for you. You're going to need a full size. There's just not enough surface. There are two major downsides to this, and some of these may be deal breakers for people. I'll start with the first one. There's no micro adjust on this, and that was one of the first things I noticed was how useful a micro adjust would be. I mean, it is a little tricky. Let's say you want to go down a relatively far ways by the end of your cut. So we set the depth stop. We got to go a ways down. Well, we can't just chunk all that out in one piece. And let's assume it's somewhere where we just can't reach a chisel or something else into to remove more and more waste, or maybe we just don't want to. Whatever reason, we got to go down, a 1/4 inch or something over time, or 3/16, and we need to go down in stages. Well, with a micro adjust, not only for fine tuning your final depth, but for just moving the blade down a little bit at a time so that we're not taking a gigantic chunk out and risking tear out, there is none here. And you have to kind of used to semi-loosening this. At least this is the method I ended up at. I don't know, maybe there's a better way to do this, but I would semi-loosen this. It's not able to fall out, but I just kind of like tap it, almost like you're adjusting a hand plane that doesn't have an adjuster. What do they call it? Yeah, like an adjuster. The way you would kind of tap the old wooden hand planes that use the wedge to hold it in there. Same concept. That's how I adjust this. But I absolutely wish there was a separate micro adjust that I could somehow buy for this. If I could get the micro adjust in this footprint, it'd be almost perfect. Number two, in terms of downside, or number three, but number two of the major ones, if you are of a certain age and you have any kind of arthritis or any hand pain or hand problems, and you need to use this for an extended period of time, it might be tricky. It might be tough. It is not a bad grip, and I understand why there's not really any other choice. But boy, your hands, your fingers, your joints can get a little sore if you're using this for a while. I made, I think, 15 of these the other day, and so I was going through and cleaning up the saw blade marks and kind of perfectly fitting them to the mortises, and my hands hurt about halfway through. My fingers, my joints, I'm a knuckle cracker. I felt like I was doing this constantly to get some kind of relief in there. It is what it is. If you added handles to this, it would just be bigger, and you might as well buy the large one. Now, Veritas does sell a full-size miniature router plane. I have no idea how big that actually is, but I guess that's an option if you want handles and very tiny. I get it. There's nothing they can do about that, but if you have arthritis, just know you're probably not going to be able to use it for long sections at a time, or you're going to have to pay a lot of attention to a very light kind of deliberate grip. Sometimes you want to just grab it and just hog out that wood. Well, as soon as you start pinching really hard, your knuckles, your fingers will get a little bit worn down. If you take smaller cuts, and this is what I've come to do mainly, is take lighter cuts so that I can just kind of easily push it out and I don't have to grip that thing like crazy. Just me personally, but I just would warn, I can see right away why the knobs would be far more comfortable if you're doing wide, kind of large usage or long periods at a time usage. So just a heads up there. But I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker at all, because I think most tasks where you're using this are not super time consuming tasks. Most people aren't spending 40 minutes with their router plane. They're spending maybe 10 at max. And you'll be fine if all you have to do is go 5 to 10 minutes max. There's really only one kind of meh thing in the middle, and it's what I talked about earlier. It's just very awkward to sharpen these blades. They're just a very weird shape and angle, and for the 1/4 inch specifically, it's just so tiny. You've just got so little to put up against there. I watched a video of Paul Sellers, and he's got this interesting method with a file. I think I'm going to buy one of those and try that way. But so far, I've just been freehand sharpening on a stone, or I use the Scary Sharp. I actually would advise a stone for this because you need to get to the very edge to do this appropriately, but I've been doing it on the Scary Sharp. It works totally fine. It's awkward at first. You'll eventually get the hang of it, of how to put even pressure on there. Keep checking and make sure you're not putting a huge skew in it. It's not the end of the world if you put a bit of a skew in it, but we like to keep this nice and square. So that's just kind of in the middle. It's a 1/4 inch, so of course it's tiny, and it's at 90 degrees because that's just how it's constructed. It's not a plus, it's not a negative, it just is, but you realize it pretty quickly when you go to first use it. And yes, you do need to sharpen this. It only comes with a primary bevel on it. You can't just take it out of the box and have it used to its best ability. It absolutely works significantly better if you get it sharp. Those shavings come off much easier. You don't have to grip as hard. If you're having to grip as hard, make sure you've sharpened it as well as you can. If you need to, watch some videos online, because the less sharp it is, the more you're going to have to really put some oomph into it. I noticed that right away. I'm going to bring you in close here and just show you a little bit of kind of tenon and groove working. One of the other reasons I bought this was that if I'm doing grooves on or dados, whatever you want to refer to them, on a box bottom, I normally have to put in a flat top grind blade or use the router to keep that flat. I don't always want to have to assume I own a flat top grind blade or that I have a router bit that is able to be used or whatever it is. I can now have the 40 tooth blade in there, the ATB alternating tooth bevel, and I can go in and clean that guy up and get it nice and flat, perfect, beautiful. So we'll look at the little tenon guy and we'll look at that, and hopefully that's enough to convince you, or maybe not convince you. Maybe it's not what you want. So like I said earlier, one of the big needs I had for this was cleaning up tiny little tenons. In the past, I always used a table saw to remove the bulk of the waste. I have a bad habit of overshooting and they become too loose and then it's wasted. So I always now undershoot by a bit. And for most of the time, I had sandpaper glued to a piece of wood and I was just sanding it down, but it never stayed flat, parallel. I was losing good glue surface. Enter the router plane, which is literally the perfect tool to clean this up. On something like this, you can see there are still some saw marks left behind. It's not perfectly flat. I cleaned this one up earlier. It is now nice and clean, perfect for gluing. So I need to do that to this side as well. Now, one of the keys here is I don't need to remove a ton of material, and I also don't know exactly how much material I need to remove because I'm taking a little bit off and test fitting it. And this is where the lack of micro adjust is really, really annoying. So to come up with my own method for micro adjusting, I've essentially just been using shims of paper and trying that out. And you get an idea of how much you need each time, and kind of over time, I fold it or I stack a few, and then I stick that in there, I shim it, I loosen this up, let that out, and now when I retighten this, I've moved down exactly whatever the thickness of this folded piece of paper is. I can try that. Oftentimes that's enough. If I need to go more, I can go more. And you can see here, if I had the full size one, there is no way I am going to be able to balance and hold and get this kind of stability on here. At the same time though, it's also not a ton of reference surface. I'm working off the edge like this. I'm gonna attempt a new angle here. Hopefully you can see better. So I'm going to just shim this again and go down that amount. Now I don't personally crank on this thing. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Look at that nice little curl shaving coming off of there. Again, this is partly going to determine how tight or how sharp you can get the blade. I just love these little tiny pieces. And the cut is just a little rough for going across the grain, of course. But just like that, I've got a nice smooth surface right there. Maybe a little more cleanup needed. It's a little awkward. I'm standing off to the side, so hopefully you can actually see this. And just like that, this is now perfect and ready for gluing up. Got minimal blowout on the sides at all. Totally acceptable for me and exactly what I'm looking for. I wasn't planning on having this happen. I was planning on discussing it, but I noticed this, and maybe it's not meant to be this way, but I've noticed if you have the depth stop off to the user's right, where it's not on the box, if you notice it's off to the user's left, it often doesn't hold. It kind of comes undone, even if you think you've twisted this thing. So just be warned, it looks all the same to me all around the sides. I don't quite understand why, but I've noticed that it doesn't always stay in place if you move it to the left, even if you think you've tightened it. So just be warned, they show it as on the left on the box, so try to remember to do that because it definitely works if you're off to the left. One downside of this, and this was actually a big thought of mine, is that we have no way of putting a fence on here. I have heavily considered drilling out one or both of these little, I assume, casting marks there, but drilling them out as holes so I could put some kind of MDF on the bottom and then build out a fence from there. Not that I need it per se, but on the full-size one, the ability to kind of set the fence and do your groove from the side seems very nice. Oops, ran into my clamp there. But you can see, nice shaving that's somewhat thick. Now, for me personally, like I said, everything I do starts with a power tool in most cases. So if I was making a rebate rabbet here, I would have, of course, set the edge by having a table saw or router bit. And then once we've set the edge, we can just reference the side of this off of there. So not having that fence is not the biggest deal in the world. But once we set the edge, then we can just follow it, of course. See if we can get a lighter shaving. One of the downsides of no micro adjust is you can't just easily get one. There we go. Look at that. Oh. And I am no expert sharpener. I am pretty amateur, and even I was able to get this to take off these thin little shavings. I'm hoping you can also from this get a reference of kind of the size and the pinching and why, if you had arthritis or something and you needed to use this for a long period of time, you could eventually come to some trouble. Heavy shaving. Oh, that's unnecessarily deep. To place it in the bullnose configuration, you loosen and slide out the little mechanism. You simply turn it around to the back side and slide the blade in. Now you have to remember the depth stop will then be relative to you on the right, but it is still on the same side we want it at from the initial point where it works best. One of the uses I mentioned earlier was cleaning up the grooves / dados, whatever you want to call it, while using an alternating tooth bevel on the table saw. You can see here we've got those ridges. When I move my pencil across, we're not actually hitting the bottom. So for me, this is an absolute necessity that I can do this. I did this relatively, well, I'll call it shallow, but it's about a ½ inch deep, and I want to just clear out all of those ridges so that we don't lose glue surface. When we have those little ridges, we're not getting any good glue contact down there. Now this is where I personally like to use shims. I'm going to just set this initial depth to whatever the high point is of those and lock in the blade there. And then I'm just going to bring, I'll take a rough cut at first. You know, let's just use this shaving. Pinch that in there. I'm going to let this down. Pull that out. All right, we'll see where that gets us. So we're definitely going to need to go down more, but that's expected. You can see we are clearing out those little tops of the bevel teeth. If you happen to have like a feeler gauge, I think that would be an excellent thing to do here. If you can afford the full size with the micro adjust, I think just use-wise for something like this, it'd be extremely useful. So if you aren't needing something small and you also have an extra $100+, full size micro adjust be very convenient. There we go. And just like that, we now have really good glue surface. I could probably go down another 1/1000 of an inch, but I can't feel these with my finger. I can see a little bit, but I'm extremely happy with that. Another place I found this very useful was for kind of grooved in lids for box joints where I don't want the side protruding. I want it hidden in there. And if you didn't get deep enough and you've already moved your router settings or something, with a chisel you're never going to get a nice clean bottom. But with this I can come in there and I can just scoop that right out. Flip it around. And then I would just obviously knock that out with a little chisel there. And just like that, I've now deepened that by a few thousandths of an inch. Extremely useful. One of my favorite new-ish tools to use, and find more ways to use it. And I think we'll call it there. That's going to end my review of the Veritas Medium Router Plane. Whether or not you buy this, that's totally up to you. Hopefully this video helped you reach that conclusion. If you have any more questions, please let me know. I will try to answer them if I can. If you want me to try something or measure something or weigh anything like that, let me know. I'm usually able to respond and try something if I have the ability or skill. If you have anything that I missed and you have this and you want to add that, please leave it below. You can either subscribe or not subscribe. I understand you can subscribe and not hit that little bell so you don't get notifications, but you still subscribe. Do whatever you want. All right, thanks for joining me today. Bye.